Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dynamically Speaking. For those of you who are listening to our podcast, head over to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Axiomatics to see the visual demo that we walk through in this episode. I'm Emme Reichert, the marketing manager at Axiomatics, and with me, as always, is my co-host, our CTO, David Brossard. Hey, David, how are you doing?
Doing good. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
Awesome. And today is another special episode, as for the first time we have a guest on the podcast that actually works with us at Axiomatics. Please welcome Mark Berg, our principal architect who has been working at Axiomatics for over 10 years. Hey, Mark, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Did you just say I'm the only employee who ever wanted to join this podcast?
Yes, that is correct.
Well, lucky me.
It did take a lot of cookies and deep dish pizza to woo you to be on the podcast. It was not cheap.
So today we're going to be talking about policy authoring, more specifically the rules to policy authoring. So what is the first thing or rule I need to know when it comes to policy authoring?
Well, let's take a step back, maybe, just to frame it a little bit. So like you said, Mark has been with Axiomatics for the past over 10 years now. I'm not counting anymore. He's not counting anymore. And so both he and I grew up with ALFA, the abbreviated language for authorization, which is the language that we use at Axiomatics to make authorization fun, let's say, to make authorization suck less. And so we kind of learned what works well, what doesn't work well in terms of policy writing. And that, of course, would apply to other languages. It's just that we use ALFA. And because it's a very simple language to understand, we figured out that it was a great way to go forward with fine-grained authorization. And so with that being said, I think to go back to your question, so Mark, what is the first thing you tell our prospects, our customers, people interested in policy-driven authorization? What do you tell them when they embark on that journey?
Well, depending where they're starting with, I definitely show them an example. So we have what we call a tutorial use case that kind of shows them what we mean by an authorization policy. So that this way we can just get some common ground in place so we can talk the same language. And then once we do that, we just kind of stress, it's like, hey, let's just keep it simple. Keep in mind what your authorization requirements are and just write them down. Write them down in simple English. For example, if you have an authorization use case that says, hey, all my managers can view all the data within their department. Well, then write that down. Just like if you were writing a .NET application or a Java app, you simply don't just start banging out code. You form a plan, you form a vision, you figure out where you're going, and then you start from there.
Cool. So should we actually just dive right in and do an example as we talk, Mark, to show people what it looks like to write policies? So with that being said, let me go ahead and share my screen so we can all see what it looks like to write a policy. And Mark, you're going to be my teacher today. So you should be able to see a blank slate. This is VS Code, right, Mark? And this is your tool of choice, your tool du jour, if you want to write policies. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
So how do I begin? What's the first thing I need to do?
Well, first of all, you have to understand what it is you're trying to accomplish. So you need to, sometimes we call those a use case. Sometimes we call them, what are your authorization requirements? Mm-hmm. So you first need to establish that. A lot of times you might do that in a Word document, or if you have some other requirement gathering software that you already use for your application development, go ahead and use the same thing here. So that's definitely where we would start.
So I could use Jira as an example to create a use case. So here I'm going to say I want to control access to medical records. Okay. And then I would try to figure out more use cases around my medical records. Is this, Mark, where I'm going to think about the different personas that I have and the different actions that I need?
Yeah. So you've kind of already defined what you're trying to protect. We call that what resource you're trying to protect. So you're trying to protect medical records. So now you need to know, well, what type of people are going to access medical records, right? You already started typing some of that, doctors and nurses. So you got medical personnel, you've got staff, you may have partners like people that work in labs. So you need to, define all those personas, and then you need to define what they can do to those records, right? Can they delete them? Can they just view them, or can they modify them? So those would be the actions, or sometimes we call those the verbs.
Okay, cool. And by the way, side note for those of you watching the recording, you can see the text in italics that's popping up. That's Copilot kicking in. If you don't have Copilot, we really recommend that you get it because it really helps with, everything from, of course, your typical code generation, C#, Python, whatever it may be, but also because ALFA is a standard, it understands ALFA, right? So it's going to help us write the policies today together. So, Mark, you've been my teacher for the past decade. I think your job is on the line because Copilot is replacing you little by little.
There's nothing wrong with having parts of your job replaced. Someone replaces all of it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Cool. So,
so this is probably a good start. We don't, just for the purpose of this example, in the real world, we'd probably list out a few more personas. But for now, we can kind of stop there, and then we can start saying, all right, under what situations can a patient view medical records? So we need to build this out just a little bit more.
So should I go ahead and create a policy for records for now and then build up my personas inside, or should I build a policy for my personas and then build a policy inside for my records? Like, what's the best way to take this?
So I think what you're asking is, should I build? So a policy is a tree structure, right? So should the top of the tree be related to the resource medical records, or should the top of the tree be related to the persona? And then under personas, define what resources they can access, versus having their medical records on top. And then as children, define the personas. There's not a right or a wrong way. I would just say to be consistent. So this way it's readable to you when you start building up other policies. They all look the same, they have the same look and feel. And it's just going to be much easier to follow and maintain if you just follow a consistent pattern. I like to use a resource first. So in this case, our policy would be, in terms of a tree structure, would be the resource. And then we have a choice between an action, reading or writing, and then the personas, or do personas and then whether they can read or write. But you've kind of skipped, like, in terms of policy authoring, like the real first step, unless you're going to have Copilot take my job, is before you can write policies, you have to have attributes. Attributes are the building blocks or the vocabulary, the words of the policy. So you have to define attributes first before you can actually start offering a policy.
So what you're saying is that now I'm creating that structure, like you said, I need to be consistent. I need to make it readable. I think one key takeaway for what you're saying, Mark, is that at the end of the day, the way you write the policy should serve the human and should be easy to manage, maintain, audit. And so starting with the object is a good way. Starting with a persona is a good way. There's not necessarily a right or wrong, but you need to be consistent because later, a month later, a year later, when you look at the policy, you want it to be easy to understand.
Yeah, and then I'll say we can put an asterisk next to right or wrong. But for example, you've got an object here called records. What if you have another object called test results? If you keep those at a higher level, you may think, hey, I may have one person authoring policies about records, another person authoring about test results. And if you make that the top object, we can split this up into separate ALFA files and have different people work on them. So it's a little bit easier to collaborate if you make a division on the object type. But again, it's not set in stone.
Okay. All right. And then I see here, I'm playing around in my VS Code. It's actually telling me when I have errors happening, right? So I can actually figure out what's happening.
Yes, that's right. The compiler will tell you when you're making mistakes, and it'll highlight those errors in here. There's another little thing here, and I am as guilty as this as anyone. Like you created a policy called view records,
Hmm.
and then later on you created a rule called doctor's view. Um, this kind of has to go with the consistency of the order in which you write things. Again, it's not the end of the world. But I'd also say again, opinion, maybe it's not necessary to call a policy view records because view is a child of records.
Hmm.
So its name is actually
View.
part of, it's records.view. Uh,
Hmm.
so it's there. It's not right or wrong, but it can, this make the names a little bit shorter.
Yeah. And we have a colleague over in Sweden who has been working on different customers in Europe, and he's got a pretty strict set of conventions on how to name things. It's almost like a programming style guide, right? I think his way is he names the policy and the rule with the eventual effect. So he would have written permit people to view records, essentially. Like he puts that first. So that's one convention that people could follow. That's not the one that I follow. I don't think you follow that convention either, Mark. But the bottom line is you have options. You need to be consistent.
Exactly. I think that's the moral of the story. There's going to be more than one way to do it. Just
Yeah.
try to be consistent, and you may change as you go along. I'm sure I did it one way when I started. Now I do it another way, and now I mix all the ways together. So I'm probably the worst example.
Oh. So, Bart, you said something earlier that kind of uh, piqued my interest. You talked about attributes. So, what are those? Like, right now, I created my policy structure. It's all nice and well, but I also talk about doctors and nurses. But how do I indicate that this policy should only apply to, say, a doctor? Like, what's that missing piece? Is that what the attribute is for?
Exactly. So, like, if you were writing a best-selling novel, right, you would use words to write the
Mhm.
novel with. In a policy, our words are attributes. So, for example, you need to know when someone's a doctor. Well, that could be like someone's role. It could be their title. Um, so just like humans have attributes, right? We have a eye color, we have a hair color if you still have your hair. You have a height and a weight. Those are attributes of people. And just like a computing system, your users have attributes in your identity store, whether that's Active Directory or JWT tokens, whatever your IAM system is. That's where you store that data. We
Mhm.
refer to those as attributes.
Okay. So, this is, I think, from what Copilot was telling me, this is how you define an attribute in an alpha policy.
Yes, that's a correct. It's not the way I would go with it, but yeah, technically that is correct.
All right, tell me, what should I fix?
Well, I would add a little bit more context to what it created. Um, so in Alpha, you have the notion of namespaces. So instead of us just building a flat list of attributes, we can add some more context around it. So for example, yeah, we can create a namespace called user and then put that attribute role in the user namespace. Because at the end of the day, we're going to have more than one user attribute. So in this namespace, we can put their role, their title, their geographical location, their department, their job code, security clearance, certifications, whatever it is. And then, yes, then the identifier you would change to user.role to give it a little more context as well.
Okay. So here I copy pasted my role attribute and then I go ahead and created a department attribute just to have another attribute to play with.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about Alpha. You can just start copying and pasting elements and then just making the little change. So you can very quickly build up an attribute dictionary.
Cool. So now, Mark, can I go ahead and use my role in my doctor policy or my doctor role?
Yeah, for sure. So you got two options here. There's
Mhm.
something called the target clause and there's something called a condition. So we can use the target clause. So here, yeah, it looks like Copilot's kind of taking over a little bit, hiding some of what Alpha can do on its own. But
Mhm.
like if you were to just delete what you did there,
Yep.
the user role doctor, you can leave target clause.
Okay. Yep.
And then this is what you're seeing, user role equals doctor. That's coming from Copilot. But if you were to do a control space and just start typing in user, you'll see that ALFA can find the attributes as well. So you can just take and select user role, and then you can just say equals doctor.
Great. But the example we wrote, that's just role-based access control, isn't it? That's not really rocket science. Could we do more than that?
Yeah, for sure. But it's always sometimes good to start with stuff simple. You start learning the policy syntax, learning the structure. So there's definitely nothing wrong with that. But yeah, we can definitely make it more fun. We can add some more requirements onto that role. So, hey, it's a role plus something else.
Okay. So we could say, is the user active, for instance? Would that be a valid attribute to play with?
Yeah, it definitely could be. We start building that out. If we could also build out, doctors can only view the records of their assigned patients.
Okay, let's try that.
And another thing, well, yeah, okay. You could also sometimes do a status or user.status with a value of active. And suppose there's a little thing sometimes, I know someone I work with has a pet peeve when you put the value of the attribute as the name. But this is fine especially if you're going to use Boolean here for true and false.
So here it auto-completed for me, but it doesn't know the action attribute. Is that because it's defined in a separate file and I need to import it?
So there's two things. Yes. ALFA will come with a kind of out of the box action ID attribute that you're welcome to use. And that's what it grabbed here. Or you can create your own action ID attributes.
Okay.
Usually people kind of create their own. That way they can name it whatever they want.
The other thing that happened is Copilot auto-completed view and record on the same line, but actually if I wanted to follow my policy structure, I think if I understood it correctly, I have to move the target up to the top level, right? Because that particular match corresponds to this particular policy.
Exactly. You want to kind of build a level of the tree where each level is checking on a different attribute and a different value. You can definitely have ands and ors in those clauses, but most of the time we just try to keep it simple.
And then here you said something along of user.assigned patients. And then you wanted to say, I think it was record.patient ID must be in the list of the assigned patients, right?
Yeah, and exactly. So some of these attributes, we're just kind of making up on the fly, but usually, like, for example, record patient ID. So when you're protecting records or whatever you're protecting, you can go to that object's data model and you can see, well, what fields does it have, right? If it's a database, what columns does it have? Those are typically going to map to attributes, right? So you've got a record has a patient ID. That's who it's assigned to. The record would have an assigned, it could have the patient's test results in there or their condition that they came in with.
Mm-hmm. So here I just created a patient ID. And like you said, I'm using namespaces to organize things, right? So it's a logical way to group attributes and policies into related buckets of things. And then I'm missing my assigned patients. So I guess I could just go ahead and copy this and define assigned patients. And this is going to be a string, and I'm going to get rid of my Boolean. So this would work, right?
Yeah, and then kind of another little trick here with namespaces. Namespaces can be nested. So if you think about it, you've got different types of users, right? You've got medical staff, you've got actual patients, right? So and a patient is not going to have assigned patients, but a doctor would or a medical staff would. So you can actually create another nested namespace under user that may be called, say, medical staff or something.
Right. Or here in this example, I was a little ahead of you and I wasn't paying attention. Sorry. Created a namespace employee for the active attribute. What you're saying is here I could have namespace medical staff and then moved my assigned patient under that because only medical staff have assigned patients, was your reasoning, I think.
Exactly. And that's just, again, creating those buckets, creating that separation. So when us humans look at this, it's really obvious, oh, the assigned patients only has to do with medical staff. Yeah, it's not about right or wrong. It's just about readability.
Yep. And then I could just update like this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There we go. Great. So that actually makes the policy way easier to read. So not only did we define our attributes, but we also created namespaces and nested namespaces to organize attributes into different buckets, that correlated buckets, if you will. And that actually makes the policy more readable because now we know what we're dealing with. And now we've actually, in a way, segregated between different types of users, the medical staff versus the patients, the medical staff versus the non-medical staff, like secretarial staff, janitorial staff, so on and so forth. So this took us just a few minutes. Is there something else I should do on a rule or on a policy to make it more maintainable, more readable in the future for my future self?
Are you trying to get me to say you should put comments in here?
Maybe.
So definitely, yes. Within Alpha, you can put comments, and you typically put them above every object, be it a policy set, a policy, or a rule.
Mm-hmm.
And this serves a couple purposes. One, you can describe what's going on in there. Sometimes these can be kind of complex, so you may want to explain it. And then two, we have some tools that will visualize this policy, and then this will become a description within the policy visualization.
Okay, great. And then we saw here again, Copilot kicking in and helping us write the description. So always, of course, verify what Copilot does for you to make sure it actually corresponds to the policy or the rule. In this example, Mark, I think the description forgets that the user also has to be active, but it's close enough to what the actual rule does. Now, Mark, I've got a question here. Let's assume I'm done, right? I wrote my policy. And so I'm going to go take it out and test it. And I'm going to send an authorization request. And I say, hey, can Alice view record 123? And let's assume Alice is not a doctor. Given the current policy, what's going to happen?
Well, we could step through the whole thing. So what'll happen is, and the key things to look at would be those apply statements, apply first applicable. So if we've asked this policy about viewing records and Alice is not a doctor, we'll get down to that rule, and this rule will not evaluate the true. So basically what happens is it says this user role is a doctor, that's false. So then the and statement will be just ignore because false and anything is going to be false. So it just stops execution and it doesn't return its effect, which is permit on line 18. So essentially, this tree would return not applicable.
Okay. So not applicable means deny, or it means something else?
That's a good question. Actually, it could mean whatever you want it to mean. But typically, within your PEP PDP architecture, you would implement a deny bias. So if you get a decision other than permit back, it should be treated as a deny. Again, this is up to you how you do it. Basically, it's just saying that, hey, there wasn't anything in this policy that resulted in an actual explicit decision being rendered for your authorization request.
Okay, so I want to tighten this down. This to me sounds like I might have a hole in my policy. So what if I started creating here a main policy? Okay. That's going to be my main entry point. And so I'm going to use first applicable like I've been using so far. Maybe you can teach me a few other combining algorithms. And then here, of course, I'm going to use my records policy that I just wrote. So Mark, because you said my policy might have a gap. You politely said it was up to me, right, to deal with not applicable, but I want to make sure I'm really tight that the only two things that could come out of my policy is either a clear yes permit or a clear no. I think based on what you told me earlier, I can wrap my policy into, say, a main policy, which is going to be my entry point. So I might as well add my comments here.
Exactly. So by doing a main, now we're building some structure so we can have different trees for different object types. And right now you're doing it all in a single file and using a reference within this file. But you can definitely break this up into separate files, and that makes it a lot easier for other people to work on.
And so here, what I'm doing, I think, is what you've taught me before, just simply create a basic rule that denies all other access. So if none of the policies before line 30 kick in, then this one will kick in and deny me access. So now I've actually created a binary set of policies. Was there a better way to do this, or is this actually a good way? And could I actually also, I'm sorry, Mark, I know it's a lot of questions at the same time. So is there another way? Is this the best way? And then assuming I do it this way, is there a way, a mechanism through which I can report on the fact this particular rule kicked in? Like kind of a little flag or a little message to the PEP to say, hey, you sent me a request that didn't really match anything that I had, so I'm just denying you access, but maybe you want to check your request to begin with.
Yeah, so let's see if I can remember all that. Is there another way? There's almost always another way. Okay. And again, we're not going to be getting about right or wrong, but so the way you have it now, let's assume you had different object types other than records, right? You had records and test results. The way it is now, you wouldn't know might not know where a match didn't happen. You just know it wasn't records. You know it wasn't test results. But by putting these kind of catch-alls deeper in the policy, you can actually then report back, hey, I did make it in the records branch, or I did make it in the test results branch. And it can provide some clues. Again, there's other ways to get the clues back. And another thing, you did a lot of typing, but you actually don't even need a rule to do this. But since you wrote a rule, right, we could have changed line 31 from first applicable to deny unless permit. And
I have changed line 28 as well, or was that too soon? I need to do it on that one.
Again, it's kind of some preferences here. There can be some side effects of doing deny unless permit up at top. We won't get into that on this discussion. I prefer sometimes to go first applicable and then within that tree have a catch-all to make sure that I catch it. So this would be kind of so this would be a shorter way of doing it.
Cool. So this actually does the exact same thing, right? It denies access, but I didn't have to write the whole rule.
Correct. Because either way, you're alluding to writing an obligation or an advice. You're going to have to write it anyway. So you can save a little disk space and not write the rule.
This is cool. I've got a couple more questions, Mark. Because I started introducing my main policy on line 27, and then I inserted my records policy on line 29, does that mean I could actually create another policy about billing, for instance, on between line 29 and 30? And because I'm not the billing person, could I also let you write the billing policy and then reference the policy that you wrote, thereby enabling some kind of collaboration in between my teams? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, of course. I think maybe a good way to do that, because we kind of mentioned, hey, just create a new file and maybe call it billing that alpha.
Okay, let's go and do that. Billing.alpha. And then here,
you're going to have a namespace. And I forgot what the root namespace was.
We'll hope Copilot got it right, and it did not get it right. So let me flip podcast. There we go. And maybe call it billing, actually, right?
Exactly. So now you got that notion of namespaces. So now we just separated this into its own namespace, and this is going to make it a lot easier to manage from an alpha's perspective. Put it in its own namespace,
Okay.
and
So
we
this is
probably
a
don't
new
need
policy,
to.
right?
Yeah, I would say we probably don't need to build this one out, just to kind of show the concept. Um, Looks like we have enough there. Then then you can go here and just reference billing.main.
Awesome.
And there you go.
Awesome. And then one cool thing is if I wanted to swap the order out and move billing first or second, I could do that. I think the idea is that they're mutually exclusive. So records probably should not influence billing and vice versa, right?
Exactly. As long as we have a proper target on the main, like, so here we had attributes object type equal record. So in billing, we would do attributes object type equal bill, I guess, or invoice, or whatever the proper term is for your organization.
The billing as an example. That's awesome. Cool. So we've covered quite a few things. I'm looking at my checklist, Mark, that I put down for this podcast here. One aspect that we briefly touched on is of course, or we talked about is the attributes, but we didn't really talk about the naming of attributes. Or I think you briefly alluded to a colleague of ours who has some preferences. Is the point of attributes to be as transparent and explicit as possible? I mean, it doesn't matter that the name is long or short. It's not going to impact performance, right? So is the goal to always use highly human readable attribute names?
I'd say yes, with an asterisk. Sometimes the names can get pretty long.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're using them here, right, it seems like, a quarter of your screen is taken up with the name of an attribute. Now, there are tricks to it, depending why it's long. If it's because of multiple nested namespaces, there's tricks with import statements we can use to make it shorter. But if we just talk about the actual leaf name of it, typically, try to keep it descriptive, but sometimes you don't want to turn it into a sentence, right? You kind of have to strike a balance.
Right. And it also goes back to the principle that attributes should be what I sometimes call primitive attributes, not computed attributes. So instead of having an attribute called is customer gold and balance greater than 1,000 and location is USA equals to true, I should actually break down into different attributes. On the one side, on the one hand, the balance of the customer; on the other, their location; on the other, their tier or their status.
Exactly. And those, again, will usually come from your data models. So if you've got records somewhere, I just overloaded the word record here, but say you got a database of billing, right? It's got columns. Those columns will become attribute names.
I think, Mark, I've run out of questions on Alpha. I'm sure there's many more things we could talk about in a future podcast, more advanced topics on authorization languages and how to use Alpha and how to create your policies. Is there anything that you want to bring up that I forgot to ask you about?
Well, I'm not sure you want to save it for later, but we kind of talked about maybe talking about kind of a fail fast method or a way to apply global authorization requirements to both records and billing. So say this is a hospital and they want to make sure that these things are always true.
So you were saying introduce a global checks policy.
Yeah. So this way, if this isn't met, then hey, we're not even going to check the records or check the billing because these things have to be met. This will vary from organization. Sometimes within a government, it's a citizenship check, right? If you're not from one of these countries, you're out. For here, we could do something simple like if you don't have a role, you're out because, a role is typically a key attribute. So if you don't have one, we're not going to be able to do any checks. So we'll just stop.
So here you're saying deny access if the user has no role.
Yeah.
Okay. So policy deny no role. Okay. And then here, we all know that this is not how we do it in alpha. So Copilot, nice try, but let's do it again. Here, I would have to use a condition if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I actually would have done something a little different here.
Tell me.
I would, instead of calling it a policy deny no role, I would have called it policy global deny checks, for example.
Okay.
And then your apply statement for fun, yeah, exactly. You knew exactly what I was going to do. And then here you can write your rule of deny no role. And the reason for that is, you're right, there could be more than one global deny check, right? You don't have a role, or maybe you're not active, right? Maybe you have that active check here as well. So you want to just put them all in here. So if you just, the way you first wrote it, you would have had a policy for each check, and that's really not efficient. So let's just create a policy that says, here's all the checks.
So now I need to go check my name. Example.
Global deny checks.
There we go. And of course, like your typical ID stuff, like control clicking and so on and so forth, renaming, refactoring, all that works because it's just VS Code doing its magic on alpha. But it doesn't understand user.role. So I need to go back and have a look at my attributes and see that it's user.role, but it's in global. So I need to go back here and do global. And that should have worked. Did I get that wrong?
Well, it's not in global. It's an example.
What's an example? Yes, of course. It's called sleep deprivation mark. There we go.
This is another example of how attributes get long. We can get rid of the example because this global is already an example. So you can add an import statement in here that does import example. And then we can just reference this as something more readable, which is user.role.
Like this.
Yeah. And another trick that we didn't explain was on line 5. We did an apply deny overrides. And this is key because imagine we have 10 different rules we're going to write here. The other key is in this policy, we should only have deny rules, right? It's a global deny check. So only put deny rules here. And by doing deny overrides, it can check them all. It can essentially collect all the deny rules and provide a reason for each one if we put an advice on each rule.
Aha, nice. So here you're saying I could say on deny, advice, explain.
Yeah, we can call it anything you want. Sometimes I use a decision reason attribute, but yeah, whatever you pick, it doesn't really matter as long as it makes sense to you. And yeah, exactly what you're doing here. So now all we need to do now is define the explain advice and define the message attribute. And typically I'll define those within the global namespace. Oops, I shouldn't have said global namespace. In the root namespace, in this case, example. So that way it's just kind of available to everybody.
Right. So you would want me to move it up.
Fine. You can leave it here. I think it's, there's always more than one way to do things, but.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah. So now if you were to have this policy on engine, send in a user, it doesn't have a role, this would kick in and it would send back, hey, you were denied because the user has no role.
Great. Awesome. And then I think, Mark, the last thing I want to do as icing on the cake is I want to ask Copilot here on the right, help me understand what the policy set main does. Let's see if it can reply. So Copilot is not foolproof.
I was going to say, we used to work with people to get really mad if you made this stuff up on the fly like this, David.
I know, but yeah, I like to live on the cutting edge of things. As long as I'm on the safe side. This is great. It actually understood it, Mark. So this actually could serve as the basis for your policy documentation.
Yeah, that is pretty cool.
Yep. Thank you, Microsoft. All right. Any famous last words, Mark, before we let our listeners go back to their daily business?
I don't think so. Maybe just to summarize, kind of start simple. Write your authorization requirements in plain English. From there, you have to identify your attributes. Definitely document. And that means different things, right? Document your authorization requirements, whether that's in the tool like Jira or even a Word document. Comments in here, that's part of documentation. And this kind of slowly build it up as you go. It's kind of like a snowball. You start maybe small and slow, and then as you get going, you build up steam, and this gets bigger and bigger much faster.
Great. Awesome. So in other words, think plain old English is the number one requirement, and then breaking down into its different moving parts, delegate and assemble.
Yeah.
Simple. Sounds like a recipe.
For cookies.
All right. Thanks, Mark. I think Emme, now next time you could actually be the one doing the policy writing.
I must say, I'm all set now.
There we go.
Awesome. And one more thing, David, I know there's some events coming up that you're going to. Do you want to quickly speak on those?
Yes, absolutely. And actually, before the events, for anyone interested in learning more about ALFA, we do provide training. Mark is our professor emeritus of ALFA. We also have a dedicated website, alpha.guide, that you can check out for more information on the language, how it works. And then, Emme, like you said, we do have 2 events coming up. The first one is the European Identity Conference in Berlin in May. I think it's the 3rd of May or the 2nd of May, all week at the Berlin Conference Center. Beautiful setting. Come check us out. We have a booth number 50, if I remember correctly. We also have a talk on Thursday talking about authorization standards. Like I said at the beginning of the podcast, it's something we care very much about. So do come check it out. If you cannot make it to Berlin, we're happy to share the slides we'll be showing there. Just drop us a note and we'll send you the material. And then in June, at the beginning of June, we will be at at Identiverse in Las Vegas. And again, another great place to go to learn more about identity and access management. We'll also have a booth. We'll also have a talk on authorization standards, Auth-Zen, OpenID Auth-Zen. And we'll be doing an interop at Identiverse showcasing what we can do in terms of authorization. So come check us out. It's going to be a fun couple months. We're super excited. And thanks for listening.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you both. This was great. And for all of our listeners, a little reminder that you can go see the demo that they walk through on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Axiomatics. And we'll see you on the next episode.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Dynamically Speaking. Stay tuned for our next one, and in the meantime, check the show notes and connect with us on LinkedIn and YouTube. And visit us at axiomatics.com to learn more about our authorization solution.